Good morning and welcome. Today we're being sponsored by the Sunday Forum Committee and by the Faith Partners in Recovery, and Jerry's going to introduce our speaker. So you got that, Jerry.
Uh, 50 miles from here is up 35E, Hazelden. We're just up past Center City. World class. Now can you hear me? I was too far back. The past Center City, it's Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, and it's a place for addiction. People to be there and research that goes on in that area. And it really is, I think, the best one in the world, the best placement. They joined Betty Ford Clinic together, and that was in Palm Springs. So it's really, really a cool place. And I wanted to introduce them because I'm an alumni of Hazelden. In December '92, I was drinking my way through a divorce. Not a smart thing to do. And I ended up in Hazelden. And it saved my life, saved a lot of money, met wonderful people, and it's a great place. So we have Andrew Williams, and are you going to go first? Darn it. Jeremiah. Yes. Practice all day. Jeremiah, he's going to lead off, and it's a treat to be able to listen to them. Thank you. And we're going to have questions at the end. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So save your questions. We'll have questions at the end.
Well, good morning. Nice to see you all. Nice to be in church on Sunday morning. On this date, 16 years ago, at this, actually about this very specific time, I woke up and I burst into a bit of rage, kind of a road rage scenario, muted, muffled, and I was pounding my pillow and angry. And that quickly transitioned into tears. I began to weep. And that was a Monday. It was September 25th, 2006. I was alone. I was in a hotel room a couple miles from the house where I lived. And I was unsure how I had spent the previous night. And I was sick and tired. And most of all, I was frustrated. I was so frustrated. I couldn't believe that I was late for work and that I was unsure of my surroundings. Again, I had drank too much. And I didn't set out to, I didn't want to, I didn't intend to, but I did because that's how addiction works. And I just didn't understand. And in that moment, I didn't know what to do. My longtime girlfriend had kicked me out of the house a couple of weeks earlier. She's now my wife, so there is a happy ending. I was living out of my car in hotels at the time. I was drinking more than ever. I was taking pills, and I didn't really have a plan. I was spiraling. I was working still, although I was late for work that morning, as I mentioned. And I think when I woke up that morning, and I'll never know exactly why that was the morning where things changed, but I imagine that I felt scared and that I felt trapped, and maybe that I had taken it as far as I could on my own. And so my life had definitely become unmanageable at that point. And in that moment, I finally gave up. I let go. I gave up trying so hard to fix things on my own and to juggle what had become a lot of chaos. I gave up trying to avoid the inevitable. And in tears, so this is what I did. After I'd gotten up and I'd been angry and frustrated and sad, I called a social worker friend of mine. And I did, for the first time, what I'd never done before, and I asked for help. And not too long after, he called back and he said there was a bed waiting for me at a treatment center down the highway. It was actually a faith-based treatment center called New Life Treatment Center in a small town called Woodstock, Minnesota. And I'm glad he called back fairly quickly, because I was still an emotional wreck at that point and still ready to go. And there's a window of willingness that is oftentimes very short for those of us who struggle with alcohol and other drugs. And he called back within my window of willingness, and I was, as I said, ready to go. So once I knew that I had a place to go and that my friend was going to be picking me up, I just waited. And as I waited, I decided to call my boss and let my boss know that I was going to get help for my drinking and that I'd be gone for a while. I didn't really know how long or exactly what was going to happen. I didn't really think of anything. I just asked for the help. But I called my boss, and he was extremely supportive, a little bit to my surprise. It wasn't a long conversation, but it felt good to sort of lay that out on the table. And when I got done talking to him, I called my girlfriend, who, again, we were a little estranged from each other, and let her know where I was going. And I played music at the time, which is the irony of me going to a place called Woodstock. I was in several bands. And I had a show that weekend at the theater. It was a big theater show, and I called the band leader and said I wasn't going to make it. That's the kind of thing that a lot of times will keep us from getting help. Oh, I can't go to treatment, or I can't get help this weekend. I've got something big happening. And then something big will happen the next week, and I still can't. But again, in that moment, I just gave up. I made all these calls. I cleared the deck, so to speak, and waited to be picked up. And, I was still halfway between drunk and hungover at that time. So my memory is a little bit foggy of all those moments. But I imagine I felt some relief at that time. And what I do remember clearly is when my friend came and he got me, and we drove down the highway. I don't remember most of what he said, but one thing I remember he said, your life's never going to be the same, don't you? And probably seemed overly dramatic to me at the time, but it was burned into my brain, and I still to this day, and I think it probably was a good expectation for him to set, because it turned out he was right. From that day forward, my path and my trajectory were forever changed. And so today, I'm really grateful to be here with you to say good morning. My name is Jeremiah Gardner, and I'm a person in long-term recovery from a substance use disorder. And for me, that means that I haven't had to use alcohol or other drugs in exactly 16 years. Thank you. Yes. And because of my recovery, I have a wife, somehow managed to salvage all that. I have a wife who I love, and I have 2 9-year-old twin boys, identical twins, who are truly miracles, because I hated kids for most of my adult life, or at least I thought I did, but stuff begins to change when you get into recovery. Your whole outlook on life changes. So they are a big part of what I attribute my recovery to. I have a home, I have a job I love, I pay taxes, I vote, I'm engaged with my community and my family, and I show up for stuff like today. And so I'm honored to spend this hour with you and with my friend and colleague, Andrew Williams, who is one of the kindest, smartest, wisest people I know, which you'll find out when you hear from him. And on behalf of both of us, I want to thank Myra Starkenberg and Rebecca Miller and everyone else on the Sunday Forum Committee, as well as Jerry and Mary and the others from the church's Sunday Forum Committee for the invitation to be here. It's really special. Andrew and I work at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, as Jerry mentioned. It's an organization founded here in Minnesota 73 years ago. We are now the largest nonprofit provider of addiction treatment, mental health care, and related education, research, and recovery services in the United States. And to be here is a little extra meaningful for us today, because one of our former colleagues and one of the pioneers at Hazelden, Tim Sheehan, Many are going to gather right here in this church on October 14th to celebrate his life. He was the founder of the Hazelden Betty Ford Graduate School of Addiction Studies, which has impacted thousands of lives across the United States and the world, including mine. I'm a graduate of our Graduate School of Addiction Studies. I have a master's degree from that school. And I know his family's, this church will always be special to his family. So it's extra special for us to be here as well. So again, thank you for having us. I will turn it over to Andrew in a short bit, and then we'll have time for questions, both online and in the room here. And but before I turn it over to Andrew, I'll share a little bit more. September is not only my sober birthday month, but it's also National Recovery Month. It's a time every year where at our organization and across the country, people really are intentional about outreach and public education about the problems of addiction, and the hope of recovery, and for celebrating the fact that recovery is a reality in millions of lives, and to do outreach. And so that's why we're here. I think that's why Myra thought to invite us here during September. And part of my job at Hazelden Betty Ford year-round is to spread the dual message. One, that substance use disorders are very common. There's 40 million people that had either a mild, medium, or severe substance use disorder in the most recent year tracked. Affects 1 in 7 of us at some time in our life, and 1 in 3 families. And it's worthy of healthcare, and it's not worthy of stigmatization or even glorification in some cases. So that's part 1 of my message that I'm sort of charged with spreading year-round. Part 2 is that with help, substance use disorders can be managed and overcome. There are about 23 million people like me who are living proof of that. And not just people like me, but doctors and lawyers and bankers and baristas and sinners, and yes, even saints, who we all humans struggle with these issues. We are wired for reward. And so substance use disorders are inherent to the human experience. We all have some risk for it. Genetics or family history is the biggest risk. About 30 to 40% of our risk profile is related to that. Second biggest risk is age of first use. So the earlier you first use a substance, the greater risk you have of developing a substance use disorder later in life. And so all genders, races, socioeconomic statuses, ages have some vulnerability. But we just don't talk enough about it. And so, that's part of why we're here today, is to talk about it. And but most of all, I think if there's one takeaway that I want to leave whenever I talk, is that while some people do face more barriers than others, and I think Andrew will speak to that a little bit, recovery and well-being are possible for everyone. And if people get the right care and the right support, they're not just possible, but probable. Roughly 3 out of 4 people who have a substance use disorder at some point in their life will achieve recovery. And so, again, I think that's defies conventional thinking about it, but it's true. And so hope is very real, and shame is unwarranted. I didn't always know that, though, as you might imagine. As I lost control of my drinking, I certainly felt like a failure. And as I did stupid, irresponsible things, I felt like a bad person. And I think that's very common with those of us who struggle with it, because we don't understand it. The pattern of waking up and not knowing what happened exactly the night before had become familiar to me, but I still was confounded. It just didn't make sense. Like, had no idea that there was something going on with my brain, that substances could, change the pathways in my brain, that I could be driven to a reward despite the consequences in the way that I was. And so, when your brain's messed up, it's hard for the brain to make sense of it. So we need to talk about it so that people can understand. We have to rely a lot of times on other people to help us see what's going on. And that's why asking for help is so crucial. I figured at some point, I just kind of figured it was who I was. This was kind of how my family was. This is kind of how our country is. But I didn't count on losing control. I didn't count on having a substance use disorder. I didn't count on having my brain be compromised in a way that I didn't even comprehend could happen before. So as my symptoms worsened, I just thought I was weak. And I thought that I somehow was willing to betray my innermost values. And that's really what ate away at me, is that my behaviors started to betray my innermost values. And a lot of the conclusions I formed were not correct, but at the same time, they were not things I wanted to admit. I didn't want to let people know that I was betraying my innermost values. So I found various ways to deny the problem and to put off getting help, which is very common, and which is why we need to talk about it and make it easier for people to get help. Why groups like the Faith Partners in Recovery at this church are so important, just to be an oasis, a beacon, some place for people to reach out. It's why when folks like me will speak or share our story anywhere, we tend to hear from people. Because there are a lot of people out there who struggle in one way or another, themselves or in their family. And that's great. That's why we do it. It's why I choose to be open about my own experience in recovery, is so that others will see that it's possible and see that there's a place to seek out help. So as I was alone with my thoughts, I tried everything. I would go to the library and try to read books and think maybe I could learn how to drink normally, that kind of thing. Because I was afraid that if I said anything, I'd be discovered, I guess, that I would be revealed. And I also feared a little bit that I would lose my identity. As I mentioned, I was a musician. I was kind of in places and in circles where drinking and partying was kind of the norm. And I had an artificial identity. That I know that now. It wasn't the real identity, but it's human nature, I think, to fear what happens if I totally change something that is sort of inherent to me. What I didn't have people in recovery to be a model. I didn't have people in my life that I knew were in recovery, that were open about it. And so again, that's part of why I'm here today, and also to acknowledge that this is really, really difficult for a lot of people, especially families. As much as I've been blessed with sustained recovery, I also know too well the other extreme. In March of 2015, I lost my mother to an opioid overdose. She was 59, and she was easily the most important person in my life. And I was working at Hazelden Betty Ford at the time and advocating for solutions to the opioid epidemic. And so, as you can imagine, it was very surreal and devastating. And it was mainly because it's a preventable loss. Addiction is and deaths related to addiction are preventable, and we can't forget that. And it was also a tragic reminder for me, because you can get a little Pollyannish maybe when you're in recovery and you're around others in recovery like I am, and forget how high the stakes are. And my mother's death reminded me of that, and reminded me how difficult it is and what can happen if people don't get the appropriate care and the support that they need. So I was fortunate. I reached out for help earlier than a lot of people do. I also had a lot of privilege and recovery capital, as we call it. I had a job, an education, a home, a bank account. I had, this kind of boggles my mind in retrospect, I had insurance that paid for every penny of my treatment. I had a supportive workplace. And I know and understand that that's not the norm for most people. And so I feel very fortunate. As a white cisgender male, I also faced less stigma than some other people do, and was able to access resources that really are designed for people like me, that were culturally specific to me in a lot of ways. And so I was lucky. I feel like I was lucky. And my life's purpose now is to help others, but to try to take luck out of the equation. Because you shouldn't have to be lucky to get help and to get better from a health condition that is common and affects humanity in the global way that it does. So that's a little of my story. I could talk about a number of different aspects of that, but I do want to get to Andrew. So I'll just leave you with, I have 6 things that I think are just takeaway messages for me that I think are important to share whenever I get the opportunity. One, as I mentioned, substance use disorders are common health conditions, much more common than we realize, and we all have risk. Number 2, they affect our behaviors, but they are not reflective of our character and morals. Our character and morals are actually revealed once you take substances out of the picture, and that's how we know that. Yeah, there are some people with bad character and bad morals who develop addiction, and that is true when they stop using alcohol and other drugs as well. But there are also people, and most people, who are just great people, but you don't see that, and it's not fully revealed until they're able to get past the substances and that impact on their life. Number 3, addiction doesn't discriminate, and neither should recovery. Everyone who struggles with substance use, even the drunk guy at the game who's being belligerent, deserves dignity, respect, compassion, love, and help from professionals and peers. Everyone deserves that who struggles with substances. Number 4, recovery is not only possible, but probable, as I mentioned earlier, when people get the care and support they need. 5, churches have a role to play. I'm really heartened to see the role, again, that your group plays here, Jerry and Mary. Not just churches, but schools, workplaces, primary health care. While addiction is not something we can pray away, the church should be a place where we can talk openly about our struggles and our imperfections and be met with love and compassion and grace, where we can learn and access resources and be steered to additional help if we need it. So again, really heartened to see what's happening here at this church. And number 6 is ask for help. You know, if there's anybody watching online or in this room who's struggling in any way, or if there's people in your family who are struggling, it's the hardest thing to do. It was the most pivotal moment in that morning 16 years ago for me. I don't know what happened exactly, if it was a God moment or what drove me to finally make that decision, but asking for help changed everything. And so I really encourage people to have the courage to ask for help. We're in the midst of the worst addiction crisis in American history. 108,000 people died from overdoses in the most recent year tracked. And 108,000 people died from alcohol-related causes as well. And it's long past time that we come together and that we bring this issue out of the shadows and keep it out of the shadows and help one another. And that's why, again, I'm so fortunate, or so grateful and honored to be here and be part of that at the Plymouth Congregational Church today. So thank you once again. And with that, I am very, very happy to turn it over to my colleague, Andrew Williams, and then again, we'll have time for questions after he's done talking.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here in fellowship with all of you this morning. First, let me thank my colleague Jeremiah. Thank you for your vulnerability and strength and courage to share your story of recovery with us. I think within your story, right, is a symbol. His story is a symbol and reminder, right, and inspiration that healing is within all of our reach as well. And appreciate you sharing the wisdom you've gained from your journey and illuminating some of the pathways, toward hope and healing that are out there for us as individuals and for our communities as well. So thank you, Jeremiah. And again, my name is Andrew Williams, and I am the inaugural Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. And I think the fact that I represent the inaugural director of DEI at Hazelden Betty Ford is a marker of our foundation's amplified and deepened commitment to expanding our mission of offering hope and healing to all those who suffer and experienced substance use disorder. And I'll speak some about my work, but I'm here, like Jeremiah, to much more share my story than to offer a promotional ad for our foundation, or to talk with you about the important work that we're doing to expand access and to sort of help support healing, justice, and health equity at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. And first, I want to also echo Jeremiah's note of appreciation for being able to be here in community and fellowship with all of you. My presence here this morning has special meaning as your longtime lead minister, Gary Ryerson, who some of you might know, presided over my most recent marriage ceremony about 14 years ago. And so Gary and this church has always had a special place in my heart, and really happy that I could be invited back here, which is also a space. I have a 25-year-old son now who lives in New Jersey. And this offered he and his peers, when he was a teenager, a safe space to come and hang out and perform and do their thing. And so being here in fellowship with all of you this morning has special meaning. And being here with Jeremiah, one of my cherished colleagues, also makes this a very special morning. And in my brief time, I want to speak to three points. I want to share with you why, as an African-American man who's largely spent most of his career in higher education as a faculty type and a high-level administrator, why I chose to do the work I do, why I've joined the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation at this particular historical moment. Two, I want to share with you some of how I've grown, what I've gained from this work. I'm just wrapping up my first year with the organization, and it has truly been a soul-growing experience, as much as it has been a really powerful learning journey for me as someone who's moved into the field, the profession of offering treatment and recovery services. I mean, I'm completely new to the field, and it's been a tremendous learning journey, but importantly, a soul-growing journey. And I want to share at the end, not just the soul-growing dimensions of my work, but also speak to what I've learned in terms of possibilities, both for individual and collective healing. What are these pathways that maybe give us a way out of the current crisis, which I think Jeremiah so powerfully contextualizes and really reminds us of the really critical moment we're in as a society. I've been very fortunate to have a range of professional and personal experiences that really propelled me to be able to compete for the current position that I'm fortunate enough to have. But what I really want to emphasize today is not so much my resume and my professional journey here, but the ways in which my lived experiences are really the grounding and foundation for why I do this work and really inform my approach to this work as well. I'm originally from Indianapolis, Indiana. We call Indiana the most southern of the northern states, and that certainly was my experience in many ways. My mother turned 18 9 days after she gave birth to me. And I'm actually going to be I'm going to run out of here after my time with you to fly down to Atlanta, where my mother currently resides, and she's having surgery later this week. So I'm not going to be able to be part of your church service today, unfortunately, but I'll be going down there to support my mother, who has her own she's been very open about her own journey through addiction and importantly, recovery as well. But I don't want to get too far astray. But I grew up in Indianapolis, and, in a not too uncommon story, because my mother was so young, my grandparents really stepped up, and the entire community, the entire village, right, the African-American village around me, played a role in helping nurture me as a young person. These were folks who were hairstylists, barbers, were working in electronic factories, the Ford and Chrysler foundries. I mean, these are the people, including my grandparents, who nurtured me. It was their work, their labor, their love that really propelled me to have the kind of professional and personal success I've had, that really informed the grounding for this life of meaning and purpose that I've been really blessed to live. And my grandfather, who raised me, and now I speak to specifically why I have this passion for racial justice and racial equity and this diversity, equity, and inclusion work that we do. And my grandfather was from Pulaski, Tennessee. And some of you might know Pulaski, Tennessee is the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. And every Labor Day, and so my grandfather was certainly on my mind as we moved through early September, we would make an annual trip down to Pulaski, Tennessee, to visit his mother, my great-grandmother. And my grandfather remained illiterate for his entire life. And so I was taken down with him partly to be his eyes and ears on the road as we made our way from Indianapolis down to Pulaski. And I think it was on one of those multiple trips, maybe when I was about the age of my daughter, now 11 or 12, that we had spent some time out on the beautiful front porch of the old kind of farmhouse. Because I want to take you on a walk, young man, I want to show you something. And he thinks, I think you're ready for this. And he took me down this long, dusty road, and we stopped at a tree. And he said, this was the tree where my father was lynched by the Ku Klux Klan. And my grandfather, like many men of that era, was a particularly kind of very warm and caring, but very kind of stoic. And it was the first time I had really seen any kind of pain, right? Any kind of quivering in his face. It was clear to me this kind of the racialized trauma that he experienced, that he wanted to share that story with me. And as you can imagine, although at 12, I did not fully understand what the Ku Klux Klan represented and how his experience fit in this larger pattern, right, of racial terrorism experienced by African Americans, you know, wherein between the end of emancipation in the 1950s, over 5,000 African American men, women, and children were lynched by the Ku Klux Klan. And my great-grandfather was one of those. And so that really resonated with me even at a young age, and I think planted a seed for my interest, my curiosity around how can people treat each other, right, in such horrific ways? What are the kind of the root causes of racism and racial terrorism? That experience is combined with me also growing up, you know, in what was called the Golden Ghetto, kind of a reference to an upper middle class kind of Black community or middle class Black community. It was adjacent to a very diverse Jewish community with 3 different types of Jewish synagogues. And in fact, I grew up spending a lot of time in and out of the Jewish Community Center. And I was one of those young Black men with a big afro, it would be with the yarmulke in the bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs of my friends. And so I grew up crossing cultural boundaries, of course, as a Black man in Indianapolis, going in and out of predominantly white schools, but also in and out of these really remarkable, very different kind of Jewish spaces. And among my first soccer coaches was a man named Michael Vogel. And on Michael Vogel's arm, like the arms of a couple of my neighbors, Mr. Frankovitz, were these serial numbers, these tattoos. And I can remember going back and asking my mother, like, why does Mr. Vogel have this tattoo on their arm, these numbers? And was told in ways that my mom understood that they were survivors of the Holocaust. You know, these days tattoos, right, are everywhere. Older people like me have them, young people have them. The first tattoos I ever saw, you know, were the tattoos of these Holocaust survivors. And Michael Vogel was a survivor of Auschwitz, as it turns out, and dedicated the rest of his life to teaching others, you know, about the dangers of ethnic and racial intolerance. And actually had a chance to reconnect with Mr. Vogel when I was a faculty member at DePaul University, where he was receiving an honorary degree. And he made a point for me to be there at his dinner the night before and to be part of his ceremony. As it turned out, I'd become a cultural anthropologist with a particular interest in these issues of race, racism, and inter-ethnic violence. And so it was a really wonderful, beautiful moment. But it was these kind of experiences, my proximity to stories and real lived experiences of racial terrorism of different sorts, my moving across these different sort of cultural boundaries, which really informed and sparked my interest in these issues of cultural difference, which led me to pursue a degree in anthropology, and which sparked my passion for social justice. As did my experience at a small Quaker liberal arts college named Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana. And so that is the real lived experience grounding for what drives my passion for this DEI work that I do at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, and I've kind of dedicated my career to. There are other stories, you know, that I want to share as well of other childhood experiences which were much different and also relate to this work. And it's, you know, part of what, and here I transition to some of what I've really come to appreciate and what I've gained from my time at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. I think it was maybe 4 or 5 months into my new position at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, about this time of year, and I was actually up north, as Minnesotans do, spending time on Lake Superior, but had a chance to introduce ourselves to our board of directors who were holding a meeting. And that meeting was started with what we call a mission moment, if I remember right, where we actually showed a video clip of 2 participants in our family program, a mother and a child who had come through the program out in California. And the mother was sharing her story of addiction, substance use disorder, and recovery. And the child was then talking about how she navigated that experience and what the healing they found at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, what that it meant for them and their relationship. And in a way that had never dawned on me, I looked at that daughter and I felt the emotions kind of welling up in me as I was listening to their story. And it's just a powerful story, and I easily cry, regardless. I've got this leaky eye kind of condition in those moments. But I think there was definitely something deeper there. And I was trying to get myself together to introduce myself to the board, and I had my little script laid out. And I said, y'all, I'm going to start in a different place than where I planned to. My name is Andrew Williams. It's great to meet you. But I want to tell you how much this last story resonated with me. Because as I looked at that child and I heard her story, I realized that was me. I was reminded of this term, right, I hadn't really thought about in a long time, called adverse childhood experiences. I was like, damn, that was me, that was that child. Because I grew up in a house, actually, as successful as my parents were, as protective and loving as my grandparents were who nurtured me. I grew up in a household that struggled not only with alcoholism, with marijuana use, but where crack cocaine was being made and openly smoked. Back then it was called freebasing. And it kind of, because of all the silences that are often around addiction and substance use disorder in our families, my grandparents who loved me and nurtured me in so many ways never talked about it, never said, we're going to remove you from that household. And I turned out okay, right? Got a college degree, graduate degree, been a successful professional. So clearly I'm okay. Like, there's no need to really interrogate that and look back at that. And it was that moment like, whoa, like that was me. And I know we as a family certainly could have benefited from the sorts of services and programs that the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation offers. And so that was that first moment of like, wow, I've got some things maybe I need to interrogate and grapple with and look at on my own journey of self-discovery and learning and growth and development and healing. And there was another moment where I began to share this story. I've been fortunate, and among the things I've been stretched to do in my new position, which I really appreciated, I'm hosting a video podcast series that will air this fall called Recovery Equity. When we'll highlight the work and voices of Indigenous people, in this particular case, who are doing work in Indigenous communities to address substance use disorder, alcoholism, and the opioid crisis. And I've had the opportunity to already interview 6 amazing leaders from Alaska, New Mexico, California. As part of what I really do appreciate this work is learning about this transformative work they're doing, and sometimes in partnership with us, sometimes not, right? To hybridize, create these hybrid models that integrate best practices in treatment and recovery, right? But transforming it, so that it's much more culturally appropriate and attentive. And I think it's been in these stories, interviewing the leaders who are out here doing the work on the front line, that I find inspiration and hope. That although we are in a real crisis moment, and I really do believe the current opioid crisis is one of the more significant civil rights issues of our time, that there is reason to be hopeful, that there are leaders in the Black community, the Indigenous community, who are doing really innovative, transformative healing work out there. We just have to know where to look. We just need to elevate their voices. But it was in interviewing one of these colleagues who's originally from Oklahoma. Her recovery story started when she was just a preteen. And she's now doing intensive work in Alaska. And I share with her my story before the interview of like, well, hey, I don't have my own personal recovery story, but this is what I experienced. And her response to me was, before we started the interview, you can't keep running. You can't keep running, Andrew. And, being kind of in the spotlights for real. And, the camera wasn't on, but it was like, all right, what do I say? And I'm a runner, as some of us talked about this morning, like, oh yeah, I like running, and just kind of brushed it off, right? And it wasn't, of course, until after the interview where I gave that comment some more reflection. I said, oh, this is what, and I kind of knew it, but it's like, hey, you can't keep running for that. There's something there, right, that needs attending to still. That although you're fine, right, she reinforced what I learned at a recent conference as well, that we all have different responses, right, to trauma. And I'd been exposed to a certain level of trauma as a youth. And my response had often been just to withdraw, to find my safe space in the house, find the safe space in the yard, in school, in sports, and I was okay. But that still meant that there was some unattended trauma. Just like I would argue we have some unattended racial trauma in society that we have yet to really reckon and repair with. And because of that, we still have an open wound, right, that we need to address. And partly what she was reminding me is that I still have an open wound that needs to be addressed. And that propelled me to then reach out to my mother. She's, been in a pretty tricky health situation recently, which pushes us, in those moments, push us all to reflect on our mortality. And so she's sharing stories and really opening up. And I said, well, let me take an opportunity now with my mother to kind of interrogate this. And I said, Mom, this is what kind of I remember experiencing growing up. And I know at one point you left the home and you moved to another house and moved to another city, and I remember it being partly about, job opportunity, and you felt like you needed to do it. And my stepfather at the time wasn't very supportive. And she goes, yeah, that was part of it, but do you want to hear the whole story? And she goes, are you sitting down? I said, yeah, Mom, I see me sitting down here on FaceTime. And my mom goes, well, I'll tell you, Andrew, it was one day I was at home and your stepfather was on his knees in front of me, like begging me for money so that he could go buy more cocaine. And when I said no, he threw the butane torch that they used to make the freebase cocaine at me, and it hit me. And she goes, I was out of there the next day. She goes, that's the whole story. I said, yeah, Mom, thank you for sharing, because I do remember, things were going on and I couldn't quite make meaning of it. Of coming home and seeing someone with test tubes in the kitchen and things being cooked up in the kitchen and funny, really unique smells. And it's like, you sometimes wonder what you make up, what's memory and what's history, and all of which is to say that, in that storytelling, this is part of what I think also learned from my time at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, that it's in the sharing of stories. It's in the sharing of our stories of addiction and substance disorder and stories of healing and decisions to protect one's family that we find healing. And it was in my mother and I sharing that story, reflecting those moments in our life, that we begin, to find healing in our relationship and for our family as well. And these are among the kind of stories that my time and work at Hazelden Betty Ford has opened up for me to explore. It's allowed me to meet these leaders that have inspired me, fuel the work that I do, and again, at a very personal level, it's also, helped me move on to my own healing journey as well, and that with my family. And it's amazing. I just recently spent 4 days with an uncle who I discovered through Ancestry.com, who 4 years ago I didn't know existed. We found each other on Ancestry and have DNA connected. Pandemic kept us from meeting until just last week, really. And he had never seen a picture of his father, who I never met as well. He passed away before I was introduced to, him as well. I was able to share a picture of my grandfather with my uncle, introduce him to my father, his half brother. And we were walking around Lake of the Isles last week or 2 weeks ago now. And I was sharing my story that I just shared with you with him. And he looked at me. He's a Vietnam vet, longtime postal worker, now retired. And he looked at me and he goes, yeah, marijuana got me through Vietnam as an 18-year-old kid. And the last thing you described, Andrew, yeah, that's the devil. That cocaine, the freebasing, that's the devil. And it got me. And he goes, I knew and came to understand that if I did not get a hold of this, get treatment and get help, that it would take me down. And he got treatment and recovered. and is now in his 22nd year of enjoying retirement, healthy, walking around the lake, biking, been married for over 50 years. And so, again, in the sharing of stories, we learn about each other, we find hope and healing. I know my time's almost up, and I just share in terms of a couple of things that other kind of takeaways that are kind of at this intersection of both personal and social community transformation. Part of what I appreciate around what Jeremiah said is that we are currently in a crisis. We reached a new record with over 100,000 deaths from opioid overdose, over 100,000 deaths related to alcohol overdoses, right? And of course, when we disaggregate that data, not to sound too academic this morning, we find that there's been a disproportionate impact on our BIPOC communities. Here in Minnesota, the death rate from overdose for African Americans is 5 times as high as it is for white Americans. We've seen alarming increases in the rate of overdose deaths among Black women who've always been lower, in these statistical charts. And the rate for our indigenous brothers and sisters is almost 7 times higher. We are really living in a crisis moment. One of the things I've learned, and this is part of what propelled me here, is we saw this convergence of the pandemic, and the police killing of George Floyd, we had a sense, we were forced to reckon with, these lingering and savage disparities in our society, especially around health and policing. And that's kind of what pushed me and pulled me in this direction. And my time at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation only deepened my appreciation for the crisis moment that we're in. And if we listen to emergency room doctors, if we listen to those who are leading organizations like ours, like Dr. Lee and Jeremiah and others, if you listen to Peter Hayden, Dr. Peter Hayden at Turning Point in North Minneapolis, I think what we're seeing is that this is a civil rights issue. It's important. This is not just a health issue. It's not just a personal issue. It's not just an issue for the economically, politically marginalized. This is a national crisis. I believe it's one of the more important, significant civil rights issues of our time. And because of that, I think the church, like it's spoken up and stepped up in other moments where we've had significant civil rights issues, I think a church that shares the kind of progressive social gospel tradition that your church does, as Jeremiah says, needs to really get involved and step into the space and thinking about how to support risk reduction programs, how to connect people like this group does, to services and information that they need. And if I've learned anything else here is that, hey, there is reason to have hope. I've learned you can't keep running away. And maybe that resonates with you or someone you know. And there is help available. And importantly, I think at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, we're increasingly making sure that our mission of offering hope and healing, is more expansive. And that all those, regardless of your ethnic or racial background, your economic status, your gender identity, that you can find hope and healing. If not with us, with other partners around the country who are doing really innovative and transformative healing work in support of health equity and healing justice. So with that, let me stop and open things open for questions.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. We usually end at about 10:50. We might go over a little bit. But anyway, if we have questions, this is the time to ask, and I'll give you the mic because we want to make sure that everybody hears the question. So maybe he answered all the questions. Okay, we got one here.
Thank you. Just from a purely statistical standpoint, how is recovery, success in recovery quantified?
You want me to take a stab at that?
Oh, did you? You're not,
It's a great
they
question.
Didn't hear the question.
Yeah, the question was, how is recovery quantified? Like, how do we define recovery? And for the longest time, abstinence, continuous abstinence has been sort of the definition of recovery. That's sort of a black and white definition, though, and as we learn more and we evolve, it's becoming a little different. So I think quality of life is in there. It's a much more nuanced measurement of what is recovery, and people have different sort of views on what recovery means to them personally. So I described to you what mine means, that I haven't had to use alcohol or other drugs in 16 years, and what that's meant to me in my life. Others might describe that a little bit differently. But so how are you doing with your relationships? How's your work? how is your, you know, how synchronous do you feel with your values, and are you able to pursue your goals? Those are all also important parts of the recovery equation and definition. So when we measure it, we do measure abstinence, we do measure like how many drinks do you take in a given period of time, that sort of stuff, but we also measure quality of life measures like I described.
I would just add, I think that's a really critical question, especially in relationship to our DEI work. I mean, how do we ever know if we're approaching health equity, right? If in fact we don't have measures for whether or not BIPOC folks who come through us are also achieving recovery at similar rates. And I think it's a challenging data point to wrap your head around, to obtain anyway, because once folks are out of treatment, they don't always stay within our orbit from recovery. And so it's just, I think, a hard thing to measure generally, right, beyond a person's subjective experience. But in DEI, I feel like if we're serious, if we have an authentic commitment, we have to have clear goals, and we have to be transparent in sharing our progress toward those goals. And I think that's the challenge for us. And so for us, I think for the front end, right, this work ultimately is not just about an inclusive workforce, about a diverse workforce. It's about that health equity and trying to have better equity in outcomes and recovery. But at this point, we have to focus on access. And are we actually giving, because access is part of the crisis, that people are suffering and can't find treatment. So the front end measure for us is getting them in. I think, how do we measure our success over the long term, when we're honest, is really challenging from a social scientific perspective, public health perspective.
Any more questions? Here.
I'm a retired physician, and I dealt over the years with quite a number of folks that also came in with mostly alcohol issues, sometimes fairly well along in their illness. And I've often wondered about how motivation can affect, I'm not sure it does, and how people can be motivated. I remember once, these were people with DTs, for example, or liver disease, other things that were threatening. And when things got stable, I said, what now? And they say, well, I gotta stop. And after a while, I said, yeah. And then after that, I decided to say, well, do you want to stop? And I get a variable response, but anyway, I don't know how it works for other drugs, but I know for alcohol, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, I think as humans, we're ambiguous about everything. We're of two minds. We want to quit, but there's other things that make us not want to quit. And you could extrapolate that to other, we want to be married, we want to stay single, we want to work and progress in our career, we want to have more family time. And so resolving those ambiguities is part of what we all have to do to make changes in our life. And so with therapy, for example, a big part of what good therapy is to help people find the motivation and to build the motivation. And other people in your life can be part of that as well. And I think that's just having that recognition, whether you're a physician or you're a family member or a clergy member, and to recognize that people have that ambiguity and to help people along that motivational path is part of our job.
Okay, looks like we have
Myra?
kind of over, but we do have an online question.
Yeah. Thank you. Myra, I have a question out Zoom land. We had can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, great. Thank you.
we can hear you.
Neighbor shot and killed on the Plymouth block last week. He left a wife and child surviving him. Some of the people were waiting to get into the food shelf and they witnessed the shooting. The police interviewed all of them. What we have in our food shelf, we have many Blacks, immigrants, people of color, clients of our food shelf. What can we do to help improve health equity with them? What can we do in terms of helping them be aware of resources in the community? Can we have literature available for them to pick up? What more can we do to help?
Yes, sure. No, I think that's an important question that follows, again, a very tragic and kind of soul-stirring story and scenario that happened. And I think some ways you begin to answer, the question that you posed us. And I mean, I do think it's important that the church plays a leading role, partly because of my heart, and I didn't have time to get into this. I mean, I think whether we're talking about the opioid crisis in our nation or within BIPOC communities, we're talking about, what to me are expressions of pathologies of power that ultimately are about a deeper spiritual crisis, right, in our society and in our culture that impacts us regardless of your race and ethnicity, though it has different kind of flavors and manifestations. And so I think the church has a critical role to play. I mean, I think here the voice of Cornel West, who says, justice is what love looks like on display in public, and that if you feel that you have a Christian responsibility to advance social justice and to advance healing, then the church does need to step up. That's partly why I'm so appreciative of this opportunity today. Like Jeremiah said, holding forums and creating spaces like this is critical to the work. I'm thinking about how you can support risk reduction programs, which might run counter to many of our values, because it's about facilitating in some ways, use, but trying to reduce risk. It is about getting information and letting the church become a clearinghouse for information. I think the church needs to be clear and strong in helping reduce the stigma that's associated with it. Yeah, you're still a child of God, even if you have an addiction, and so it's about, spreading, that gospel of love, expanding that circle, of love that includes trying to be an educational force and a real healing force as well.
So yeah, what I'll do is we can formally end, but I don't know, are we allowed to keep the mics on a little bit longer? We can keep the mics on. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so next week we have another program, of course, called the Dale Street Bridge and the impact that the construction of I-94 had on St. Paul's Rondo neighborhood. So we hope you come back for that. And if there's more questions, we can still ask them.
Stick around a little bit, and I can also answer questions online if that's possible.
Yeah.